Mashinka, I am so grateful to have you here speaking with us because I've been getting questions for a very long time on different topics related to Armenia. And whenever there's something that I don't know enough about, I always look for people who do. So you are one of those people, and I'm so grateful to have you here. Thank you.
So glad to be here. Thank you so much for inviting me to talk to you.
So I would like to start with maybe just telling everyone watching why I invited you here. Who are you? What's your personal story?
So I am a senior researcher at the Berggruen Institute, and where I'm lucky enough to be one of your colleagues. I emigrated here to the US in 1991 with my mother. And when we immigrated, the Artsakh Liberation War was underway in Artsakh, Nagorno-Karabakh. We actually left Armenia a few weeks before it attained independence in December 1991. We left right before a period that was known as the Dark Years, which is when an internal energy crisis combined with blockades essentially cut off access to all basic resources, and everything was rationed. Food was rationed, electricity was rationed, and there were stories of young children who saw electricity so infrequently that when it would come on for the 1 or 2 hours a day, they would actually be afraid of the light because they were so unfamiliar with it. My mother saw the destabilization of the country coming, and so she left so that I wouldn't have to live through that. And we were lucky to get out when we did, but many were not so lucky.
And that's when you came to the US.
We came to the US and we moved to a diasporic community called Glendale in California, whose population is now roughly 40% Armenian. I moved around quite a bit afterward for school and things like that. And then just a few months ago, came back to Glendale. So I'm happily speaking to you now from Glendale, California.
I know Glendale is having the best Armenian food in town.
It does enjoy that distinction. Yes, there is nowhere else to go for kebab. That's a bit unfair. I'm obviously speaking it, as a Glendalian.
I understand that. I won't hold it against you. So I want to understand a little bit more about what's happening right now, because over the past few weeks, we've seen deadly violence break out between Armenian and Azerbaijan forces in this region that you were just referring to. So can you explain to us what's going on?
On September 27th, Azerbaijan launched a very highly calculated military offensive against Artsakh with the direct support of Turkey. They had been transporting Syrian mercenaries to the area as early as mid-September. They had stockpiled Israeli-supplied munitions, drones supplied by Turkey, and after the fact attempted to claim that their offensive was a response or retaliation to something that was launched by Artsakh, which makes absolutely no sense in the geopolitical context, given that Artsakh has a population of 150,000 and very few resources. And Armenia is also a much smaller state with none of the oil wealth that Azerbaijan has, and none of the backing that it has from a superpower like Turkey. Armenia and Artsakh had absolutely nothing to gain by launching this offensive. While it's being represented as a territorial dispute between equally matched opponents, it is absolutely nothing else than a genocide. Genocide Watch issued a state of emergency there in Artsakh on October 23rd and classified what's happening there as a stage 9 and 10. 9 and 10 in the Genocide Watch rubric correspond to extermination and denial.
I'm still curious how things have escalated recently. How did we get here?
To think about the sort of historical forces that brought us to this point, we would go back to the early 20s when, as the Soviet was beginning to develop and to build up its territories, the region was Sovietized by Joseph Stalin, who took the territory of Artsakh, which was historically an Armenian populated territory, and essentially gifted that stolen land to Azerbaijan. But then in the 90s, as the Soviet was collapsing, Artsakh voted to reunite with Armenia, and that set off this chain of violence. So after years of fighting with 30,000 casualties and unfathomable loss and violence endured by both sides, there was a ceasefire brokered by the Minsk Group in 1994, chaired by the US, Russia, and France. And the terms of the ceasefire were that Armenians would remain there and continue to govern themselves in that territory, but that territory was internationally recognized as part of Azerbaijan.
What is the latest kind of on the ground right now?
Since its beginning, the estimates are between hundreds to over 1,000 who have been killed. Artsakh's civilian infrastructure continues to be destroyed. They're now using white phosphorus in regions that are close to civilian populations and is banned by international humanitarian law. They're using cluster munitions, which is also banned by international humanitarian law. So to look at images of Artsakh now is to look at this dystopic nightmarescape of debris and infrastructural wreckage.
What's the geopolitical situation here?
So Russia has been selling arms to Azerbaijan, but its affinity traditionally lies with Armenia, largely because of its military bases in Armenia and because of the fact that they have a security agreement. So Russia has promised to intervene if there's any violence on Armenian soil, but that agreement does not extend to Artsakh. In terms of who else is intervening right now at this moment, no one. No one. There have been statements issued by the rulers of certain nations. Canada has stopped its arms dealing with Azerbaijan, seeing what's going on. But apart from that, there has been very little response on the part of the international community to this situation.
So the conflict that we're seeing right now, from my understanding, the Azeris view it as this territory that is illegally occupied. What it sounds like you're saying is that it's something much deeper than that, and bringing up words like genocide at any time is very scary, but given the history of what has taken place in Armenia, it's incredibly alarming. So can you explain to everybody watching who may not be fully aware of the context of what happened 100 years ago that makes these words so terrifying to all of us when we hear them in this context?
Absolutely. So 100 years ago in 1915, Turkey executed the attempted eradication of Armenian peoples in the Ottoman Empire, led by the Young Turks, who are ultra-nationalist, pan-Turkist group. And the genocide involved massacre, deportation, death marches through the Syrian desert, and resulted in the deaths of 1.5 million Armenians. Turkey denies that the genocide ever took place, and in fact often criminalizes the utterance of the phrase Armenian genocide, or criminalizes acts of claiming that the genocide took place within Turkey. I'm the direct descendant of Armenian genocide survivors. My great-grandfather he was living in Turkey when the genocide took place, and he fled with his wife at the time. And there's this sort of apocryphal story in my family about how when they were in transit, they were stopped by Turkish guards. And when he got out to go speak to them, his wife heard there was a shot that rang out, and she believed that he had been killed. And when he came back, she had what they assumed to be a heart attack, and she had died. And so the stories and narratives of the Armenian genocide are really palpable for genocide descendants. And the story I just told is one of countless innumerable stories, as tragic or more so than the one I just communicated.
It's so hard to wrap my head around it, because hearing these stories and knowing that it happened, it's incredibly frustrating to see how much denial there has been. The US hasn't even formally recognized the Armenian genocide until this year, which is...
It didn't actually proceed with that. The vote was a yes, but it didn't make it all the way through.
Can you explain? So the Senate passed the resolution, and then it was blocked.
It was blocked from going all the way through. And the reason for this is that Turkey has an ongoing massive campaign to ensure denial. It wants to ensure denial both because the recognition of the genocide by major power players would be very damaging to Turkey's own narrative about its history as a nation, and also because the recognition of the genocide would require repatriation of land, it would require reparations, and those are things that Turkey is actively invested in preventing. And in fact, when it seemed like the US might get close to recognizing the genocide, major players in Turkey actually threatened to recognize the US's genocide against the indigenous peoples of North America. So there's a very well-funded Turkish campaign of denial.
I read Samantha Powers, who's the former ambassador to the UN, and she's probably one of the most mainstream writers on genocide. And I read about her campaign at the centennial anniversary of the genocide to get President Obama to acknowledge it for the first time formally. And understanding the politics behind that, it's this unspoken thing that everybody knows, but no one will say. I get so angry and I feel my blood boiling whenever I even read about someone denying the Holocaust happened. I've never even met someone in person who's ever said that. And it still infuriates me. And for Armenian people, this is just a consistent reality. And just to have major statesmen that President Obama knows that it happened, but he just won't say it. And this is time and time again for over 100 years. And I'm just wondering, how do you overcome that sort of anger and denigration, especially when it's so recent and it's so personal?
I think that's a great question. There are a lot of coordinated political organizing efforts within the Armenian community toward genocide recognition. And there are marches all around the world every year on Armenian Genocide Remembrance Day, which is April 24th. So there's an ongoing campaign for genocide recognition. There's this understanding that whenever something as traumatic as a genocide occurs, that the effects of it don't just extend to the generation who experiences it, but there's this intergenerational passing down of trauma and collective memory. And so descendants of genocide survivors carry that collective memory, but also carry the knowledge that that memory is invalidated by the historical record. And that's incredibly difficult. There are also many scholars and policy experts today who suggest that that focus on the genocide and genocide recognition, which is so crucial without question, has also in some ways prevented Armenians from being able to have the luxury of developing a political imaginary about the future. Because when your past traumas remain unrecognized, it's very difficult to develop an imaginary of the future.
Yeah. And that makes perfect sense, because I think that people don't realize how important recognition really is. And so I really hope that can change over time. A really important part for me in moving on and understanding one another is art and culture. It's how we learn how to be human. And that's something I really wanted to talk to you about, because it's something that's a really big part in your life. When we talk about survival, we often think of our physical survival, and then survival of memory, stories that are passed down from ancestors, family members. But there is also cultural survival, and that's more of a collective form of survival. What role do you think that plays in the broader understanding of people and community?
My background as an art historian was specifically in artwork that also functions as a kind of political organizing at the intersection of art and politics. And so all of the research that I do thinks about artistic practice as a kind of political practice. And in the context of the practices of diasporic peoples, or peoples who have been traditionally marginalized or oppressed or displaced from their homeland, cultural practice is a way of attesting to continued existence. It's a way of archiving continued existence. And this is also why part of the violence in the Artsakh region, and not just within this genocide right now, but even in the years prior to it, has involved the destruction of historic monuments, of archaeological sites, of cathedrals that have stood for millennia. Cultural genocide is, if you are really looking to exterminate a people, then exterminating any cultural remnants of their existence is also crucial.
I came across this incredible article that you wrote. This blew my mind, that 40% of Glendale's residents are Armenian, but this art gallery basically said that they were doing this big exhibition honoring the artistic community of Glendale, and there was not one Armenian artist. Why was this so offensive that you felt that you needed to take the time to write this review and let it be known, and you and many other local Glendale residents and Armenian artists really didn't let this go? I want to know why that mattered so much to you.
This exhibition was held in a publicly funded municipal space, which also suggests that it's supposed to represent the public, that it's supposed to represent the communities that make up the city. There were 32 artists in this exhibition, and the vast majority of them were white. Glendale is a rich and heterogeneous community of Latinx individuals, Korean, Filipinx, Armenian individuals, and to claim to represent that community and to whitewash its histories of immigration, to redact the histories of the immigrant people who have lived in that community, is an act of erasure. And because they were doing this in Glendale, they felt that they weren't accountable to the people of Glendale. They frequently and publicly made jokes, as well as in interviews and media, about how this is just a biennial in Glendale, and the people were shocked that there was even cultural output in Glendale. And what that does is to suggest that the communities that make up this city are communities that have a cultural deficit, and communities who needed culture to be imported to them by these newly relocated individuals. And that was an erasure that the communities of Glendale couldn't sit with, I think largely because, particularly for the Armenian American diaspora, they'd already been through so many historical erasures. And to have built up a life world here in this space, and then to have that life world completely erased, was not something that people felt they could swallow, and rightly so.
Yeah, I think it was incredibly admirable. And we've seen that time and time again. I feel like there's not enough attention that's drawn to that, because whether it's the Cultural Revolution in China, or I'm from Spain, we had a lot of that during the Spanish Civil War. Syria is one of the oldest lands in the world for human civilization. It's devastating to see what's happening in places like Aleppo. How can we bring more awareness to the importance of not only physical survival, but cultural survival? What role can we all play?
I think supporting and giving visibility to Armenian and Armenian diasporic artists right now is crucial. So many of them are making incredible work that brings attention to the genocide in Artsakh. There's a collective called She Loves Collective here in Los Angeles that's been doing performances called The Rifles Our Ancestors Didn't Have, that try and stage sort of performance works as political demonstrations at different sites around the city. There's a project by the artist Kami Abrahamian that involves taking over urban space with calls to recognize Artsakh. And so I think attending to those projects that are popping up and really striving to amplify their visibility is one concrete thing that people can do. There are also multiple funds that are being run for humanitarian aid to Artsakh, including by Quiddigs as well as by Armenia Fund. And they are providing on-the-ground aid to people who are being impacted by this crisis.
Thank you so much for sharing those resources. When it comes to misinformation and lies being spread online, I find it really difficult to know where to find the right sources. And I know it's a challenge that a lot of people watching this right now are having. So my advice is always just try to get as broad coverage as you can and speak to people like you just mentioned, Armenian people, or people on the ground and people who are there, and read as much as you can from different sources. Do you have any advice or tips, and how can we spot misinformation?
That's a great question. I think that one very easy way to spot misinformation is when one notices that the reporting that they're reading is completely absent any historical context. Because that's been one of the primary ways in which this crisis has been misrepresented, by divorcing it or severing it from all of the historical factors that led up to this moment. And secondly, by looking to independent, accurate news sources. And I can recommend EVN Report, which provides independent on-the-ground reporting from Armenia and Artsakh, as well as Erasure. These are both reputable sources that are providing impartial, accurate coverage.
That's great. I'm going to include those links as well. So everyone, just do your homework, read as much as you can, and try to inform yourselves, inform your own opinions.
What's been most alarming to Armenians as well as Armenian diasporans in all of this has been watching what I've called the global cacophony of silence around this issue.
Yeah.
In 1915, when the Armenian genocide was occurring, there was a similar response. So what's happening now feels like reenactment of history.
Thank you for that. That's why I really wanted to focus this conversation on the human element, because politics aside, and whatever politicians or nations or ideologies that we support, we should always recognize when inhumanity is occurring, or when human rights are being violated. And these are things that we have seen time and time again, and we should know better by now.
I want to thank you so much, Natalia, for using your platform to bring attention to this. It's incredibly meaningful to me and to so many other members of my community.
It is my privilege to do. Thank you so much for taking the time to speak to me and sharing these stories that are not easy to talk about.